It's hard to imagine London before the fire, before the stone streets and the big, neat buildings, before the wide roads and the big squares. In 1666, London was different. The streets were narrow. Some were so tight you could stretch your arms and almost touch both sides. The houses leaned in toward each other, their upper floors jutting out, almost meeting above your head. The smell was a mix. Fresh bread from a bakery, the tang of fish from the river, the sharp, earthy scent of horses, and sometimes the not-so-pleasant smell of the open drains that ran down the middle of the street. Most buildings were made of timber, wooden beams that had darkened over the years. Many were filled in with wattle and daub, a mixture of sticks, mud, and straw. It worked fine for keeping the wind out. It didn't work so well when flames came calling. London was alive with noise, even in the quieter hours. The clip-clop of hooves on cobblestones, the calls of street sellers, hot pies, fresh apples, children shouting as they ran through the lanes, and always the steady hum of people going about their business. The River Thames was the city's lifeline. It carried goods in from the sea, spices, wool coal. It carried people, too, in small wooden boats that bobbed gently in the current. Some folks preferred the river to the streets. It was faster and safer, usually. The city's skyline was marked by church spires, dozens of them, scattered across the view. St. Paul's Cathedral, the old one, stood tall and proud, its medieval tower rising over the rooftops. The churches weren't just places of worship. They were meeting spots, landmarks, and, as some would soon discover, obstacles in the path of a spreading fire. Life was simple in some ways, hard in others. Most people lived close to where they worked. Bakers slept above their ovens. Blacksmiths kept their families in rooms behind the forge. Merchants had their shops on the ground floor, with storage or bedrooms above. Londoners were used to small fires. It was part of life. A tipped candle here, a cooking accident there. Bucket brigades would form. Neighbors would shout and help each other. But the fires never grew too big. Not until that September. The city was still recovering from another disaster, the Great Plague. Just the year before, in 1665, it had swept through London. Tens of thousands were gone. Some streets felt emptier than they should. There was a quiet unease in the air, the kind that makes people wary of bad luck. And the summer of 1666 had been hot. Too hot. Weeks without rain had left wood dry, brittle, and ready to catch. The air was dusty. The grass in the little gardens had turned yellow. Even the river looked low in some places. But people still went about their days. Children still laughed. Merchants still called out their prices. The city, in its own way, was content. London had no idea it was standing on the edge of something that would change it forever. The streets were still busy. The bakeries still warm. The smell of fresh bread still drifted out into the morning air. No one knew that one loaf, one oven, and one unlucky spark were just days away from rewriting the city's story. The summer of 1666 had been long, and dry, and hot. It wasn't the sort of heat that made people rush to the river for a swim. It was the kind that lingered. It pressed down on the city day after day, until you felt it in your bones. Weeks had passed without real rain. Not the quick, light showers that came and went in minutes. London needed steady, soaking rain, the kind that darkened the streets and washed the dust from the air. But the sky stayed clear. The streets grew dusty. Every footstep kicked up little clouds that hung in the air before drifting away. Even the horses seemed tired. Their hooves clopped more slowly, and they stood in the shade whenever they could find it. The bones of the city began to feel strange, dry, brittle. It wasn't just the beams of the houses. It was the doors, the carts, the market stalls. Anything made from wood seemed ready to splinter at the lightest touch. In the small gardens behind houses, grass turned yellow. Herbs wilted. The air held the faint smell of dryness, a scent you only notice when it has gone on too long. People began to talk about the heat, not in fear, not yet, just in the way neighbors do, leaning on a doorway or over a fence. Hot again today, not a drop of rain in weeks. It became a part of the city's background noise. The Thames itself looked lower than usual. Boats rocked gently in the slower current. Some of the riverbanks were wider than they had been in years. The exposed mud cracked in the sun. Fishermen pulled in their nets with less catch than they liked. They muttered about how the river felt sluggish, as if even the water was tired. Inside the houses, the heat stayed trapped. Rooms smelled of baking bread, not because anyone was cooking, but because the walls and floors themselves seemed to hold the day's warmth. At night, it didn't cool much. The city was wrapped in a heavy, still blanket of air. Bakers worked in conditions hotter than most could stand. Even without lighting the ovens, their shops were warm. Once they fired up for the morning bread, the temperature climbed to the point where you could feel sweat on your skin after a few seconds. The heat also made people restless. Markets were quieter. Conversations shorter. Fewer children ran through the streets. They sat in doorways, fanning themselves with scraps of paper or bits of wood. Small fires happened here and there, as they always did. A chimney spark on a thatched roof. A cooking pot tipped too far. These were handled quickly, but some took longer than they should have. The water from wells felt warm to the touch, and the bucket brigades moved slower in the heat. If anyone had been counting, they might have noticed more little fires that summer than usual. No one kept track. People were too busy going about their days, too used to the idea that fires were just a fact of city life. The churches stood the same as they had in cooler years. Their wooden pews and paneling grew dry. Even the great doors, carved and heavy, felt lighter to the touch, as though the air had drawn something out of them. London, in late August, felt like a city paused in a breath, still, waiting, though no one could have told you what for. Those who worked near Pudding Lane, the small street where the fire would soon begin, might have noticed the smell of the bakery more strongly than usual. The dry air carried scents farther, and the rich, yeasty warmth of fresh bread spread down the lanes. It was a comforting smell, one of the few pleasures left in the heavy heat. But comfort can be tricky. It can hide the danger that's building just out of sight. Because all around, the city was quietly becoming tinder, and tinder only needs one spark. It began on a quiet night. Saturday, the 1st of September 1666, it ended like most days in London. The markets had closed. The streets were dim. Lanterns flickered here and there, casting small circles of light on cobblestones. The city slept. Not the restless, twisting kind of sleep, but the steady kind that comes after a long, hot day. A breeze wandered lazily through the alleys, carrying the faint smells of bread, fish, and smoke from evening fires. On Pudding Lane, a narrow street in the heart of the city, most windows were dark. Shutters closed. Doors bolted. Only one building still held a steady glow, the bakery of Thomas Farriner. Bakers worked odd hours. If bread was to be ready for the morning, the ovens had to be fired in the middle of the night. Inside, the air was warm, warmer than the rest of the city. Wooden beams overhead, blackened from years of baking, seemed to lean closer to the heat. We'll never know exactly how it began. Some say a spark jumped from the oven. Others imagine a pile of kindling catching in the wrong place. What's certain is that it started small. Small enough to go unnoticed for a few moments. Small enough that no one thought to shout. But fire doesn't think about the hour or the mood of the city. It simply finds what it can use, and in that bakery there was plenty. Wooden shelves, flour dust and air, dry baskets, The kind of things flames love. The heat grew quickly. A flicker against the wall became a steady tongue of fire. The tongue became a hand. The hand reached upward. Someone must have noticed then the strange light, the sharp scent of burning would cutting through the warm smell of bread. But in those first moments, there was no panic. Fires happened. They could be dealt with. The problem was, the summer had left everything ready to burn, and the buildings leaned so close together that the flames barely had to stretch to find the next wall. The wind that night was small at first, barely enough to ruffle the edges of a cloth. But even a lazy wind can be a friend to fire. It slipped between houses, carrying sparks in its folds. A thatch roof here, wooden beam there. The fire began to step from one building to the next. Inside the bakery, there was shouting now. The buckets were brought out, water sloshing in the glow. But water from a single well can only do so much. And every second, the fire grew hungrier. Neighbors appeared in doorways, drawn by the noise and the light. Some stood still, watching. Others ran to wake friends. The air began to carry a new sound, the sharp crackle of timber giving way. In the distance, church bells started to ring, not for worship, but for warning. It was the city's way of saying, "Fire is here." The sound rolled through the streets, low and steady, mixing with the growing heat. By the time the first real attempts to contain it began, the fire was already bigger than the lane. The buckets formed a line, water moving hand to hand. But every splash on the flames seemed to vanish with a hiss, leaving the fire untouched. And then the wind shifted. It came from the east, stronger now. It pressed into the fire, pushing it toward the heart of the city. The sparks leapt higher. Pieces of burning timber broke away, landing on roofs far ahead. It was still night. The rest of London didn't know yet what was coming. For now, it was just Pudding Lane. Just a bakery. Just a fire. But fires have a way of making just into everything. London in 1666 was a city built to burn. Not on purpose. It just happened that way. Most buildings were made of timber. The beams had been cut and fitted years, sometimes decades, before. They had dried and hardened over time, turning into the kind of fuel a fire can't resist. Some houses were filled in with wattle and daub, a mix of mud, straw, and sticks, but the wooden skeleton was still there beneath it all. The streets were narrow. Houses leaned forward toward each other, their upper floors sticking out like elbows in a crowd. If one wall caught fire, the flames didn't have far to go to find another. And inside the houses, candles, cloth, paper, wood furniture. Everyday things that people didn't think twice about. All ready to catch if the heat was high enough. The fire on Pudding Lane found all of this waiting. It climbed up walls. It spread along rafters. It dropped embers onto anything that would take them. Then came the wind. Not a storm wind, just a steady push from the east. Enough to bend smoke sideways. Enough to carry glowing sparks from one street to the next. The wind worked like a partner to the flames. It fed them air. It lifted them higher. It took their heat and carried it to places the fire hadn't even reached yet. Some people later said it was like the fire had a mind. It seemed to know where to go. But it wasn't thinking. It was simply following the paths laid out for it by the way the city was built. Firefighters of the time didn't have the hoses and engines we think of now. They had buckets. They had long fire hooks to pull down burning thatch or timber, hoping to stop the fire's path. Sometimes they would even demolish buildings to make a fire break. But in the crowded city, that was hard to do quickly. And here was the trouble. By the time anyone thought about pulling down houses, the fire was already too big. The heat was too strong to get close. The flames too fast to work ahead of. The wind carried burning scraps high into the air. Some landed blocks away, on roofs that seemed safe just minutes before. A single ember could settle into a dry beam and start the process all over again. It wasn't just the houses that were at risk. The warehouses along the river stored tar, pitch, and oil, all things that burn hotter and longer than wood. Once the flames reached them, the fire would have even more fuel. By dawn, the fire had already spread beyond Pudding Lane. The glow could be seen from across the city. The smell of smoke was thick enough to taste. Even those who lived far away began to wake to the uneasy feeling that something big was happening. But still, there was no full picture. In those early hours, people thought it would be like other fires, bad for one part of town, but not the whole city. They didn't yet know that the wood, the wind, and the way London was built had turned this into something different. Something that wasn't going to stop easily. The city woke slowly that Sunday morning. The bells were still ringing low and steady, carrying over rooftops and along the river. At first, the sound might have been mistaken for a call to early service. But the tone was different. Urgent, even if you didn't yet know why. People stepped out of their doors, blinking against the pale morning light. The air already smelled of smoke. Not the faint whiff from a chimney, but the thick, layered scent of something bigger. Wood, pitch, and burning cloth all mixed together into a heavy, bitter taste at the back of the throat. Those who lived near Pudding Lane could see the fire clearly now, orange against black. Flames leaping above rooftops, rolling smoke climbing into the sky. The wind pushed it toward them, carrying the heat before the flames even arrived. Some stood and watched, as if trying to understand what they were looking at. Others moved quickly, calling for their families, grabbing what they could carry. There was no siren, no broadcast, no quick way to tell the whole city what was happening. The news spread the old way, mouth to mouth, neighbor to neighbor. In the narrow lanes, people began to push past each other, arms full of clothes, bedding, or whatever seemed worth saving. A man might be carrying a single chest. A woman, a bundle of blankets with a child tucked inside. Someone else, a birdcage, all moving away from the growing glow. The streets filled with the sound of footsteps and low voices. A cart rumbled past, piled with sacks. A dog barked from somewhere unseen. Above it all, the wind carried the crackle of burning wood, sharp and uneven. The fire hooks were out now, long poles with iron tips. Men worked to pull down sections of houses in the path of the fire, hoping to slow it. But each pull took time, and the flames were faster. The wind seemed determined to push them forward, down the streets and into the heart of London. Bells rang from more churches. Some rang in warning, others perhaps in prayer. From the spire of St. Magnus the Martyr, the view toward the east showed a rolling sea of smoke and sparks. The watchers there must have known that the river itself would not be enough to stop it. The Thames, busy even on a Sunday, became a road of escape. Small boats ferried people and possessions to the other bank. Some were calm, rowing steadily through the haze. Others were crowded and loud, the oars striking the water in a quick, uneven rhythm. Markets that might have been opening that morning stayed closed. Shops along the lanes locked their doors, even as their owners carried what they could away. In the open squares, people paused to watch the sky darken. The sun, climbing higher, was already a dull red disk behind the smoke. The city was waking, but it was waking into confusion. No one could see the whole shape of the danger yet. Each street knew only its own view. A wall of flame here, a thin line of smoke there. And everyone hoped in those first hours that would pass them by. They didn't yet know that the day ahead would be hotter, louder, and far more dangerous than anything they had ever seen. In 1666, London didn't have a fire brigade. Not the kind we imagine today, with uniforms, hoses, and engines. It had people. And buckets. When a fire broke out, The first thing to do was form a line. One person at the well, another at the pump, hands passing buckets down the chain, water sloshing with each handover. At the other end, someone would throw the water onto the flames. Then the bucket went back along the line to be filled again. It worked for small fires. A tipped candle, a chimney spark, something that hadn't yet taken hold. But the fire that Sunday morning wasn't small anymore. The first bucket lines on Pudding Lane were short and frantic. Men, women, and children all passing water as quickly as they could. The problem was, the flames were already higher than the roofs. Water thrown onto the base hissed and vanished into steam. The heat was too much to get close. Fire hooks were brought in. Long poles with metal hooks used to pull down burning wood before the flames could spread. In theory, it worked. In practice, the wind pushed the fire into every space the hooks created. Pull-down walls just gave the flames new fuel at their feet. Some tried another method, blowing up houses in the path of the fire to create a gap. Gunpowder could stop flames if it removed enough buildings ahead of them. But this needed approval from the city's authorities, and approval came too slowly. By the time orders were given, the fire was already racing forward. The bucket lines grew longer as more people joined in. But longer lines meant slower water. And slower water meant the fire stayed ahead. From the river, people dipped buckets directly into the Thames. They threw water on warehouses, docks, and moored ships, hoping to protect at least some part of the city's trade. But even the river seemed to feed the fire. The wind carried sparks across it, dropping them onto roofs on the opposite bank. The heat was strange. It didn't just come from the flames. It seemed to hang in the air, pressing against your face, drying your throat. Even those far from the front line could feel it. And in the streets close to the fire, the air shimmered like it does above a summer road. The work was exhausting. Hands blistered from passing buckets. Clothes soaked from spilled water, then steamed dry in the heat. Some gave up and joined the flow of people carrying their belongings away. Others stayed, shouting to keep the line moving. There was no single leader. Each street seemed to fight its own battle. Sometimes two bucket lines would meet at a corner, one feeding water to the other without a word. It was a kind of cooperation born from necessity, but it was scattered, unplanned. By late morning, the fire was far beyond Pudding Lane. Bucket lines had been abandoned in some areas, replaced with the grim work of clearing out homes before the flames reached them. People carried what they could, then turned to watch their houses disappear behind the smoke. The truth was settling in. This wasn't a fire that buckets could beat. London's churches had always been a source of comfort. Their bells marked the hours. Their spires guided people through the winding streets. Their heavy stone walls felt like safety itself. But in 1666, even the churches couldn't stand against the fire. The first to be threatened were the small parish churches near Pudding Lane. They were built close to houses, some even sharing walls with homes or shops. And though their outer walls were stone, much of what was inside was not. Pews made of oak, screens carved from wood, pulpits polished smooth by generations of hands. All of it dry from the long summer heat, all of it ready to catch. When the fire reached the first church, the flames licked at the door as though testing it. Once inside, they moved quickly. The high wooden roof trapped heat and smoke, turning the air into an oven. Windows cracked from the heat before shattering, letting in more air for the fire to breathe. From the street, the sound was strange, a deep, roaring echo, like the building itself was groaning. Sparks leapt from the tower into the wind, carrying trouble to other roofs. By midday Sunday, several churches were burning. Some tried to save them, hauling water up steps, aiming at the doors and windows. But the size of the buildings made it hopeless. Once a church's roof caught, the fire raced along it faster than any bucket line could follow. The loss of a church was more than the loss of a building. They were landmarks, meeting places, shelters for the poor. When one was gone, it left a hole in the life of the neighborhood. Even the great St. Paul's Cathedral was not safe. The old medieval structure was in the path of the flames, its roof covered in lead. Some believed the stone walls would keep it safe. But stone doesn't burn, it cracks, and lead melts. As the fire moved closer, the heat reached the cathedral's walls. The lead began to drip, falling in silver streams that hissed when they touched the ground. The air shimmered with the heat rising from it. People watched from a distance, unwilling to believe that St. Paul's could fall. But belief doesn't change heat and wind, and both were on the side of the fire. By nightfall, the skyline that had once been marked by spires was broken. Some towers still stood, blackened and hollow. Others had fallen, their bells buried in the rubble. The churches had always been the heart of London's neighborhoods. Now, one by one, those hearts were being silenced. The River Thames had always been London's friend. It brought goods from far away. It carried passengers when the streets were too crowded. It gave the city its rhythm, with the tide rising and falling like a slow breath. But during the fire, the river became something else. A witness, an escape route, and in some ways a wall the flames couldn't cross. From the water, the fire looked like a living thing. It climbed and shifted, bending with the wind, reaching toward the sky. The smoke rolled over the river in thick waves, turning the morning sun into a pale red circle. Boatmen worked without pause. Some ferried people from the burning side to the other bank. Others carried belongings, chests, sacks, crates, stacked so high the boats rocked under the weight. A few brave souls rowed toward the docks, hoping to save goods before the fire reached them. The air above the river was no cooler than the streets. The wind pushed the smoke low, forcing people to squint and cover their mouths. Ash drifted down, settling on the water like black snow. Sometimes a piece of burning timber would fall in with a hiss, sending up a puff of steam. Along the banks, warehouses loomed over the water. Many stored tar, pitch, and oil, things that burned hotter than wood and sent up columns of black smoke. Once the fire reached them, the explosions of heat and light made even the riverboats pull back. Fishermen's huts and small houses along the shore didn't last long. The flames moved through them quickly, leaving only blackened posts jutting from the water. Boats tied up too close to the bank caught fire themselves, their ropes snapping as they drifted away, burning from bow to stern. From the south bank, people gathered to watch. They stood in silence, the heat still reaching them across the water. The city they knew was disappearing behind a curtain of smoke. Some pointed out landmarks as they vanished, as if naming them would keep them alive a little longer. The Thames was busy that day, but not with its usual cargo. It carried the city's fear. It carried the last possessions of families. It carried the sight of a London no one would see again. And through it all, the smoke kept moving, thick, rolling, and endless, hiding the city's edges and making even the river feel small. The narrow lanes of London had never felt so small. They twisted and turned, barely wide enough for two people to pass without brushing shoulders. On ordinary days, they were noisy, crowded, and full of life. But on that Monday morning, they were something else entirely. A maze of fear. The fire was moving faster now. The wind pushed it into places no one thought it would reach so soon. People who had gone to bed the night before thinking they were safe woke to find smoke curling past their windows. Doors slammed. Footsteps echoed on the cobblestones. Families poured into the streets, carrying whatever they could manage. A blanket stuffed with clothes. A pot of coins. A small child still half asleep in someone's arms. The air in the lanes was thick and restless. Voices rose and fell. Some shouted instructions. Others called out names, searching for missing relatives. Some spoke in the flat, stunned tone of people who couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. Carts were loaded in a hurry. One might carry sacks of grain. Another, furniture piled so high it leaned dangerously with every bump. Horses snorted and pulled, their eyes wide in the smoke. The lanes that led toward the river were the busiest. Everyone seemed to be moving in the same direction, trying to reach the water before the fire blocked the way. But the crowd slowed itself. In places, it stopped completely, packed so tight that no one could move without pushing. Some tried to turn back, looking for another route, only to find the fire already there. The orange light flickered against the walls, casting moving shadows that made it hard to tell where the danger truly was. In the middle of it all, there were moments of strange calm. A child clutching a wooden toy, staring at the sky. An old man sitting on a doorstep, resting his head in his hands. A dog weaving through the crowd, unnoticed. Everywhere, the smell of burning wood and fabric filled the air. The sound of crackling seemed to come from every direction at once. The lanes, once familiar, now felt like traps. Some people began to throw possessions into the street, hoping to make room in their carts for something more important. Bedding lay in the gutter. Chairs tipped over against the walls. A broken mirror glinted in the smoky light. As the morning wore on, the fire's glow grew stronger. It reflected in the eyes of the crowd, turning them into small, frightened mirrors. The panic didn't come all at once. It crept in the way the smoke did, slowly, until it was everywhere. By midday, the lanes were almost empty. Those who could leave had gone. Those who couldn't were hidden indoors, waiting for the fire to pass, or for it to find them. The city was still burning, but in the narrow lanes, only silence and smoke remained. The Great Fire of London didn't end quickly. It didn't sweep through in a single night and fade by morning. It stayed. It grew. It worked its way through the city, street by street, for 4 long days. Day 1 had started with Pudding Lane. By nightfall, the fire had moved far beyond it, carried by the wind and fed by the dry timber. Churches had fallen. Warehouses had gone up in bursts of light. The river was crowded with boats full of people and possessions. Day 2 was worse. The wind strengthened, and the fire leapt across gaps people thought would hold it back. Buildings that had been pulled down as fire breaks burned anyway when sparks landed on the rubble. The air was so thick with smoke that people covered their faces with cloths, damp they could manage it. The streets were a mixture of rushing feet and abandoned belongings. Day 3 brought the fire to its widest reach. By then, whole neighborhoods were gone. Flames climbed high enough to be seen from the hills outside the city. In some places, the fire moved like a wave, roaring forward in bursts. In others, it crept, smoldering in cellars and beams before suddenly flaring up again. The night sky glowed red, and the city never really went dark. The fire was its own light, casting long shadows that danced on walls and across the water. Day 4 was when the wind finally began to drop. Without the steady push of air, the flames lost some of their speed. Bucket lines and fire hooks could finally get close enough to make a difference. More houses were pulled down ahead of the fire's path, and this time the gaps held. Even then, the work wasn't simple. Some fires burned stubbornly, tucked into the corners of warehouses or deep inside wooden beams. People dug through rubble to find embers and stamped them out before they caught again. By the end of the 4th day, the main fire was under control. But the smoke still hung over the city. Small fires smoldered in hidden places, and the air smelled of wet ash and charred wood. No one knew yet how much had been lost. The streets were unrecognizable. Landmarks were gone. Whole stretches of the city were now nothing but blackened frames and piles of stone. 4 days had changed London. For days had taken a city of wood and trade and turned it into a place of silence, rubble, and smoke. And still, somewhere beneath the ash, embers glowed. When the fire was finally out, the city felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful, just empty in a way that didn't feel right. The air still smelled of smoke. It clung to clothes, to hair, to every wall still standing. If you brushed your hand along a stone building, it came away gray with soot. The ground was littered with pieces of the old city. Half-burned beams lay across streets. Roof tiles crunched underfoot. In some places, only a single wall still stood, leaning awkwardly, as if unsure whether it should keep going or fall. The heat had gone, but the streets were warm in places where embers still glowed under the rubble. Now and then, a small puff of smoke rose from the blackened piles, like the fire was still breathing in its sleep. People began to return, picking their way through what was left. Some carried baskets to salvage anything that might be useful. Others just stood and looked, trying to match the ruined streets to the ones they remembered. It was harder than you might think. Without the familiar buildings, the city's map seemed to have vanished. The sound of rebuilding hadn't started yet. There were no hammers, no saws, no shouted instructions. Only footsteps, quiet voices, and the occasional creak of something shifting under its own weight. The churches that had survived were crowded. Some offered shelter to those who had lost everything. Others stored what goods had been saved from the flames. The air inside smelled of smoke and damp clothes. For many, the loss was not just a home or a shop, but a way of life. Bakers without ovens, merchants without stock, boatmen without the goods they carried. The fire had taken not only buildings, but the work that kept the city alive. There were questions, too. How had it started? Why had it spread so far? Was someone to blame? Rumors moved through the streets like wind through an open door. Some pointed to carelessness. Others whispered about sabotage. But there was no answer, only the same blackened streets. Food was scarce. The markets had burned, and supplies were scattered. Those with more than they needed often sold at high prices, and tempers sometimes flared. The fire was gone, but its heat lingered in other ways. And yet people stayed. London had burned before, though never like this, and each time it had been rebuilt. Already, some were measuring plots, marking where walls might rise again. The city would come back, though it might not look the same. For now, it was a place of ash and silence, a place where every street told the same story, a story written in smoke and ruin. The fire had left London in pieces, but it hadn't left it empty. People stayed. They camped in tents, in half-burned houses, in makeshift shelters along the river. Life, in its slow, stubborn way, went on. Rebuilding began almost as soon as the smoke cleared. At first, it was just small repairs, a roof patched, a wall shored up so it wouldn't fall. But soon, bigger plans took shape. The city could not simply be put back the way it was. Too many streets were gone. Too many landmarks had vanished. Some wanted to rebuild quickly, just to have a home again. Others saw a chance to make the city better. Wider streets, buildings of brick and stone instead of wood, stronger walls that might stand against another fire. Bricklayers and stonemasons found themselves in high demand. Their hammers and chisels filled the air with a new kind of noise. Timber still had its place, but it was no longer the skeleton of every building. Brick rows began to rise where narrow, crooked lanes had once been. The new designs tried to make space. Houses no longer leaned in over the streets. Shops were built with gaps between them, and some streets were made wider, enough for carts to pass without brushing the walls. Not everyone was happy with the changes. Some missed the old, close-knit lanes, the shadows they cast on summer days, the way a neighbor could call from one window to another without raising their voice. But change was part of survival. Markets returned first, set up in open squares or along the riverbank. They sold whatever they could get: bread, fish, cloth tools. People came not only to buy, but to see each other again, to trade news, to talk about what had been lost and what might return. Churches, too, began to rise from their blackened foundations. Some were rebuilt in their old style, others redesigned entirely. The bells, once silent, began to ring again, though fewer in number. Even St. Paul's Cathedral was marked for rebuilding. Its new design would be grander, stronger, and far more resistant to fire. But it would take years before it stood ready. In the meantime, London learned to live alongside its own ruins. Some streets still carried the smell of smoke. Some walls still bore black marks from the fire's touch. They were reminders, but they were also part of the new city's foundation. Rebuilding was slow. It would take years before London looked whole again. But with each wall raised, each roof finished, each street cleared, the city began to feel alive once more. The fire had taken much, but it had left something behind. A determination to stand again, even if the shape of the city was forever changed. When the last embers cooled, the fire left more than ruins behind. It left stories. Some were true, some were not, and some were somewhere in between. In the days after the fire, people wanted answers. How could something so big have happened? Why couldn't it be stopped? And who, if anyone, was to blame? The simplest truth, that a bakery accident had started it, didn't satisfy everyone. It seemed too small a reason for such a huge disaster. So the stories began to spread. Some said the fire had been set on purpose. Whispers moved through the streets about foreign agents, spies, or enemies of the crown. Others pointed to religion, claiming the fire was God's punishment for sins, or the work of one faith against another. One story told of a man seen running from Pudding Lane with a torch. Another claimed someone had been caught scattering fire through the streets. No proof was ever found, but the stories stayed alive because they gave the disaster a villain. Even the way the fire behaved became part of the myths. People spoke of flames that leapt like living creatures, chasing certain buildings while skipping others. Some swore the wind changed direction on purpose, as if the fire knew where it wanted to go. Then there were the strange survivals. A single house left standing while everything around it burned. A wooden sign untouched, though the wall it hung from was gone. These became stories of luck, of divine protection, or of secrets hidden in the walls. In taverns, the fire grew in the telling. It became hotter, faster, cleverer. The smoke darker, the noise louder. The facts blurred until the fire was as much legend as memory. Years later, when the city was rebuilt, people still repeated the old tales. Children heard them as bedtime stories, half frightening and half exciting. Visitors were told of the great blaze in ways that made it sound like a creature from an old folk tale. But behind the myths, the truth remained simpler. A spark, a dry city, a strong wind. No magic, no plot, just the dangerous combination of chance and the way London had been built. Even so, the myth stayed, because sometimes the story people tell feels more satisfying than the truth they know. For all the myths and stories, the real causes of the Great Fire of London were not hidden. They were there in plain sight, in the way the city was built, the way it was kept, and the way people lived. London in 1666 was made mostly of wood. Not just the homes, but shops, warehouses, even parts of the churches. Wood that had been drying for years. Wood that could catch fire from a single spark. The summer had been long and hot. Weeks without rain had left everything dry. Timber cracked in the heat, thatch grew brittle, and even the dirt in the lanes felt dusty underfoot. The streets were narrow. Houses leaned toward each other, so close that in some places you could reach from one upper window to another without stepping outside. When fire caught in one building, it had only to stretch a little to find the next. Inside the houses, the danger was everywhere. Candles for light, open flames for cooking, chimneys that hadn't been cleaned well enough, and in a bakery like Thomas Farriner's, ovens that ran hot in the quiet hours before dawn. The city's firefighting methods were too small for the scale of the fire. Buckets, fire hooks, and the occasional use of gunpowder to make a fire break. All of it relied on acting fast, and all of it failed once the fire had gained speed. Then there was the wind. Steady and strong from the east, it fed the flames and carried sparks far ahead of the main blaze. Even buildings thought safe were at risk when a single ember could land on their roof and start the process all over again. The warehouses by the river added their own fuel. Tar, pitch, oil, and other flammable goods burned hotter and longer than wood. Once they caught, they made the fire even harder to control. Finally, there was the simple fact of timing. The fire started in the early hours of a Sunday, when most people were asleep. By the time it was noticed and the first efforts made to stop it, the flames were already too big for the tools they had. It wasn't one cause, but all of them together. A city built of wood, dried by heat, crowded into narrow streets. A spark in the wrong place. A wind in the wrong direction. And no way to fight it once it began. In the end, the Great Fire was not a mystery. It was the result of the way London had grown, quickly, without enough thought for safety, and without imagining that one small accident could change the whole city. The real causes were simple. The real lesson was clear. But even with those lessons, history would still remember the fire more for its myths than for its truth. When the last smoke faded and the rebuilding began, London was not the same city it had been. The streets were different. The buildings were different. Even the way people thought about the city had changed. The Great Fire had destroyed over 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and countless shops and warehouses. But it also cleared away centuries of cramped, twisting lanes and old wooden structures. What rose in their place was something new. Brick and stone replaced much of the timber. Wider streets gave more space between buildings. So the most crowded, tangled neighborhoods were opened up into squares and broader roads. It was a quieter kind of change, not as sudden as the fire itself, but just as permanent. For those who had lived through it, the fire was a memory they carried everywhere. The smell of smoke on a windy day could bring it back. The sound of church bells could remind them of that Sunday morning when the alarms began to ring. Even children who had been too young to remember grew up hearing the stories. The fire became part of the city's identity, a warning, a legend, and a point in history everyone knew. Some saw it as a tragedy. Others called it a chance for renewal. For most, it was both. A loss that could never be fully counted, and a beginning that could never have happened without that loss. St. Paul's Cathedral rose again, grander than before. Its dome became one of the most recognizable shapes on the skyline. The new churches, the new streets, and the new homes carried the marks of lessons learned. But time, as it always does, softened the memory. The Great Fire became less about the heat and the smoke and more about the stories told afterward. It was something to point to in history books, to mark on a timeline, to tell visitors as they walked through the rebuilt city. And yet, somewhere under the paving stones and the new brick walls, the old city still rests. Beneath the London of today lies the London that burned, its beams and tiles, its cobblestones and soot, its shape forever altered by 4 days of fire. The Great Fire of London ended centuries ago. But in a way, it never really went out.